Good afternoon, everyone. I don't have any opening comments, so.
Really? There's so
Matt?
much going on.
And I expect
And
your questions will fully cover
and
everything and give me
nothing.
the chance to expound on all of those things.
All right. Well, let's start with this warning to the Israelis about improving humanitarian aid deliveries to Gaza. What can you tell us about this?
A few things. So first, Secretary did write along with Secretary of Defense Austin to the Defense Minister of Israel, Yoav Gallant, and the Minister for Strategic Affairs, Ron Dermer, on Sunday to make clear our concerns about the levels of humanitarian assistance that have been making it into Gaza. This was a letter we consider to be a private diplomatic communication that we did not intend to make public from our side, but now that it is public, I'm happy to confirm it and speak to it to some extent. I think you have to put this letter in the context of our ongoing and long-lasting communications and concerns about the levels of humanitarian assistance that have made it to Palestinian civilians. If you go back to April, the Secretary wrote at the time to Minister Gallant to make clear that we had seen the levels of humanitarian assistance plateau, and then after they plateaued, start to decline, and made clear that at the time that the levels were unacceptable and that we needed to see Israel implement changes. They did make changes. The changes that they made caused humanitarian assistance to increase. We got up to somewhere between 300 to 400 trucks going in on some days to Gaza. But the thing that the Secretary also made clear at the time is that the increase couldn't be a one-off, that it needed to be sustained. And what we have seen over the past few months is that the level of humanitarian assistance has not been sustained. In fact, it has fallen by over 50% from where it was at its peak. So the Secretary, along with Secretary Austin, thought it was appropriate to make clear to the government of Israel that there are changes that they need to make again to see that the level of assistance making it into Gaza comes back up from the very, very low levels that it is at today.
And the consequence, if they don't do that, is what?
So I'm not going to speak to that today. Obviously, we made clear when we released our report that was mandated under National Security Memorandum 20 that there are provisions under U.S. law that require us to make certain certifications. And to make those certifications, we have to see that Israel is not arbitrarily denying humanitarian assistance, making it into Gaza. When the Secretary made his conclusions under that report in April, he did so based on the changes that we had seen them put into place and the increased levels of humanitarian assistance. But of course, those levels of humanitarian assistance have to be sustained.
Yeah, but what's the consequence?
There are implications under U.S. law, under policy, that I'm not going to speak to here, largely because we hope that Israel makes the changes that the Secretary outlined in the letter. We have seen Israel make changes before, and when they make changes, humanitarian assistance can increase. And we have seen Israel just in the past few months work with humanitarian organizations to implement a polio vaccination campaign inside Gaza. So we know that it's possible to get humanitarian assistance into Gaza. We know it can be done. We know that the various logistical and bureaucratic obstacles can be surmounted. And so it is incumbent upon the government of Israel to surmount those challenges and get assistance in.
I mean, you say that there are implications to it. Obviously, under U.S. law, that's assistance. Is there specific assistance that come under scrutiny over this?
So I don't want to deal with any hypotheticals. You are right that it's just a plain reading of U.S. law. If you look at the provisions of U.S. law, that we are required to conduct assessments and find that recipients of U.S. military assistance do not arbitrarily deny or impede the provisioning of U.S. humanitarian assistance. That's just the law, and we, of course, will follow the law. But our hope is that Israel will make the changes that we have outlined and that we have recommended, and that the result of those changes will be a dramatic increase in humanitarian assistance. Ultimately, we are focused on the bottom line here. It's just it. Humanitarian assistance had been low. The changes that we had recommended had gotten it up, and those levels have not been sustained, and so we need to see further changes by the government of Israel.
I mean, obviously the timing of this, I know you don't explicitly do politics, but there's an election coming up here. To what extent is that a factor? I mean, 30 days from now would be after the U.S. election. It's been a year since the conflict has been ongoing. The president has repeatedly warned Israel about assistance, about civilian casualties, with at best mixed results sometimes. This happened in just 30 days before the election. I mean, to what extent was the election a factor in this?
It is not a factor at all. The bottom line is we felt it was appropriate, if we are making clear to the government of Israel that there are these changes that need to be implemented, that we give them an appropriate period of time to implement them. We didn't think it was appropriate to send a letter and just say this has to happen overnight. We give them make clear there's a short window in which we want to see changes because the humanitarian situation is so dire on the ground, but it is appropriate to give them some time to work through the different issues and find ways to get the level of trucks, get the level of food, water, medicine back up to acceptable levels. Yeah, Omar.
Hi, Matt. So the 620I Foreign Assistance Act actually doesn't have the word arbitrarily. You say it's the law, but the NSM 20, which is a memorandum, has the word arbitrarily. So the Foreign Assistance Act says, when it's made known to the president that the government of such country prohibits or otherwise restricts directly or indirectly the transport of delivery of United States humanitarian assistance, it does not have arbitrarily. So given you are already saying humanitarian assistance is very low and putting in front of Israel a bunch of concrete measures on how to improve it, why are you waiting for another 30 days to implement the law?
Because we believe it's appropriate to give them a chance to cure the problem. And international humanitarian law does make exceptions for certain, I'll give you an example. Dual use items is a good example. If there are dual use items that legitimately could be used as a military purpose, of course, governments aren't required to let those dual use items in, which is not to say that they can use that exception as a blanket restriction on anything that can be used as a dual use item. For example, if there are military movements happening in a certain period of time, governments can restrict the provision of humanitarian aid during that period, because obviously you wouldn't want to put humanitarian workers at jeopardy. So it is not accurate to say that there can be no restrictions. It's that those restrictions ultimately can't block civilians from getting the humanitarian access that they need. And that is what we're focused on doing. And so we think it's appropriate. Ultimately, let me just say, ultimately, what we want to see here is results. This isn't about making a rhetorical statement. It's not about making any kind of threats. It's about seeing the situation reversed. And so that the civilians in Gaza who are not getting adequate access to food and medicine and other humanitarian goods today actually see, as a result of our efforts, a change in their daily lives. And that's what we're focused on achieving, and that's what we are trying to achieve through this letter.
Sure, but I guess what I'm trying to get at, and I'll ask it again, is like, we've been at this for over a year now. You have made these warnings dozens of times, if not more, from this podium. Secretary has done it, President of the United States has done it, and yet we're here. Other outlets have reported, but Reuters has reported all the way back in April that officials from this department have assessed in internal memos that Israel, quote, is persistently and arbitrarily impeding aid in Gaza. So if the law is already being, if it's already doing it, why is the United States waiting?
So first of all, that is not, so we've been over this before, I know, from this podium. There are people that reach that conclusion, and there are people inside this building who reach the opposite conclusion. So I think it's important to state that for the record, that when you have a difficult situation as this, it's not uncommon for people to reach different assessments. Ultimately, if you look at the last year and our record of working to get humanitarian assistance into Gaza, what you've seen is the U.S. intervening at critical moments. Going back to October 12th, let's not forget that it wasn't October, it was October 16th. So just a few days after October 7th, that the secretary was negotiating with the government of Israel until 2 a.m. in Tel Aviv to get the first trucks into Gaza. I know you were there. And over the coming months have intervened on multiple occasions when we thought the levels of assistance getting in weren't sufficient, when there were policies that needed to be changed, when there are new gates that needed to be opened, we have intervened to get that to happen. And you have seen those results. You've seen us go from 1 crossing being open to 4 crossings being open. And that is the result of U.S. intervention. Now, to answer your question, we have always said that this is an ongoing process, and our assessments are ongoing. They're not static, they're dynamic. And so when the situation changes, our assessments will change and we'll act accordingly. And that's what we're doing.
And how did the Israelis respond to this letter?
They can speak for themselves. I'm not going to speak for them.
Have you received any assurances that they will actually take these concrete measures?
So I'm just not going to speak for them. Those are private diplomatic conversations. They can speak to their reaction.
And one final thing. What is your message to the world when they question U.S. credibility in terms of following through? Because President Biden made a similar threat to cut off or restrict U.S. military aid in April if Israel carried out a major operation in Rafah. Regardless of what you call that operation, Rafah is now like a wasteland. And we have seen one shipment of 2,000-pound bombs being withheld, but everything else, billions of dollars worth of weapons have continued. So what do you say to people who question the credibility of U.S. in terms of following?
So first of all, I will say, without getting into all of the details, that not all of the premises of that question are accurate when it comes to the communications between us and the government of Israel. What I will say is look at our track record of intervening to get humanitarian assistance in, and look at the fact that when we have seen levels, when we have seen Israel not follow through on the steps that they committed to, and when we have seen the results not measure up to the standards that we expect, we have intervened with them to turn those around. And that's what we did in April. And it wasn't just a letter from the secretary, it was also the president making this clear directly to the Prime Minister Netanyahu that we needed to see changes and that our policy would be dependent on the changes that they made. And they made those changes. Now, what we also said is that the changes need to be sustained and the level of humanitarian assistance needed to be sustained. And over time, we've seen the level come down, which is why we are going back in and making clear now that it needs to be reversed.
Oh, sorry, one really final thing.
You already said one more. I have to
Yes.
go.
At the end of that letter, you also talk about establishing a new channel to raise civilian harm incidents, which sounds in a way incredible because it's been over a year. So can you elaborate a little bit on that effort? What kind of a channel you want to establish? And are you saying that Israelis basically ignored the U.S. in all of the previous communications when U.S. raised its concern about civilian harm?
I'm not going to speak to it beyond the language that's in the letter, other than to say that we continue to see Israel not taking sufficient steps to address civilian harm. And you have to look no further to understand that than the really horrific results over the weekend.
Thank you, Matt. Does this building see any inconsistency between sending a sternly worded letter with a 30-day lead time about humanitarian conditions in Gaza to the Israelis while near simultaneously deploying an advanced anti-missile system with 100 U.S. troops to man it?
No, of course not. We have
What's the
always
message being sent
made clear that we are committed to the defense of Israel, and that's why you saw the president make the decision that he made, which I will let my colleagues at the Pentagon speak to in detail. But we've also made clear that there are provisions of U.S. law that we follow, and we will always follow those provisions. And part of that is expecting that the Israeli government fully comply with the requirements under international humanitarian law to make sure that humanitarian assistance gets into Gaza.
Sure. I mean, and this is retreading territory that Humaira and Matt just raised with you. But I mean, 6 months ago, there were suspicions that humanitarian law was not being followed by Israeli forces. So why 6 months on, if the situation is similarly deplorable, do you suspect that situation is meaningfully changed?
You're right. It is a bit of a retread, and I hope you will accept my apology for giving the same answer,
No,
the same question.
Fine.
I think it is important to be clear that it is because we saw the situation change. I think the premise of the question, the premise of Humaira's question, is that the situation has been static all along. It hasn't been static. When we intervened back in April to make clear that the level of humanitarian assistance getting in wasn't sufficient, we saw it increase. And we saw that increase sustained for a period of time, but then not long enough, and it came back down. And so we're going to respond to events as they happen. And when humanitarian assistance increases, and is an acceptable level, you won't see us raising those concerns. But when we see the situation on the ground that we've seen over the past few months, when we see the level of humanitarian assistance in September, the lowest it has been in any month since the war began, it's appropriate for us to intervene in this way.
And to briefly address the flip side, I mean, the Israeli argument is that allowing this aid in provides fuel for Hamas. They run a protection racket, they get money, they get funds, essentially they think that taking this step is effectively choking off Hamas. Does the U.S. dispute that that is a reason why the Israelis are limiting this aid?
So there are, without a doubt, security concerns inside Gaza that make it difficult to deliver aid, that has led to the looting of humanitarian assistance in some cases. But the answer to that is not to stop the flow of food and water that civilians depend on, and that little babies and children need to survive. That cannot be the answer to that problem. The ultimate answer to that problem is to establish a governing authority in Gaza that can provide safety and security for the Palestinian people of Gaza, that can provide safety and security for the delivery of humanitarian assistance, that can provide a long-term political path forward, as we have been making clear for some time. The answer absolutely cannot in any way be penalizing the innocent civilians who depend on this food, water, medicine to live.
Okay, I don't want to monopolize time. I have two more. One is, does the U.S. feel that it has clarity? You don't have to specify what it is on the timing and the targets that Israel intends to strike in its retaliatory strike on Iran. Does the U.S. feel that it has clarity on the timing and targets that the Israelis intend?
We have had a number of conversations with them about that. Those conversations are ongoing, and I'm going to stick with the policy I set out last week, which is I'm not going to speak to those conversations publicly.
Okay, and just one bigger picture question for clarity. Is it the U.S.'s stance right now that it is calling for a ceasefire in Gaza, but not calling for one in northern Israel and southern Lebanon?
We continue, so a few things. No, we do continue to want a ceasefire in Gaza, but to be clear what that is, it's not a unilateral ceasefire. We have called for a ceasefire agreement that includes the release of hostages. I think you know that what the details of that. And when it comes to Lebanon, ultimately we want a diplomatic solution, and that policy hasn't changed.
But there's no sort of active call for a ceasefire in the same way that there is in Gaza, accompanied by a hostage deal. Is that because the U.S. sees that there is a legitimate and achievable military objective on the part of Israel in northern Lebanon in a way that does not exist in Gaza?
So we believe that Israel has a right to attack and degrade the Hezbollah battalions that continue to be just over the border from northern Israel. But ultimately, we want to see a diplomatic solution. I would say that the two situations are incredibly different when it comes to Lebanon. There's United Nations Security Council Resolution 1701 that we want to see fully implemented. That resolution has requirements for Hezbollah that they have not fulfilled. So it is appropriate for Israel to conduct military operations to degrade Hezbollah's capabilities. So maybe they will pull back beyond the Litani River and finally agree to the provisions of 1701 that they have blown through for 18 years now. And that doesn't change what we want to see in Gaza, which is ultimately a ceasefire agreement. But it's a ceasefire agreement that has burdens on Hamas as well, not just on Israel.
Can I just follow up on something that you said to my colleagues? Look at our track record when it comes to intervention, intervening when humanitarian aid going into Gaza is too low. But my question is around the timing of this letter. I mean, the World Food Program says that there are no trucks that got into Gaza in the month of October, but September and August weren't great. There were 700 trucks, according to the World Food Program, in August, only 400 aid trucks in September. So why wait till it gets to zero to actually do something?
You should not assume that this letter is our first and only conversation with the government of Israel about this problem. We have been having a number of ongoing conversations with them about the very serious decrease in the level of humanitarian assistance. Ultimately, we did not see our concerns sufficiently addressed, which is why the two secretaries sent the letter they did today.
Okay. And with regard to
on Sunday, yeah, I was about to correct myself. They sent the letter that is made public today that we sent. They sent on Sunday.
Okay, and then with regard to action that Israel has to take in order to clear this hurdle between you guys and make sure that they aren't actually not abiding by humanitarian law here, do they have to take every single action that was laid out in the letter?
I'm
in
not
the
going
next
to get
30
into
days?
that level of detail beyond what's in the letter. I think the letter speaks to it pretty clearly. It outlines the steps that we want to see them take. Ultimately, what's important to us is that the people in Gaza get the food, water, medicine, other humanitarian assistance that they need to survive.
Right, but you're not going to measure, you're not going to lay out what that, mark of success would look like?
I think the letter lays it out pretty clearly, and I'm not
Well, the
going to
letter
go beyond
says
that.
to reverse this downward humanitarian trajectory and consistent with its assurances to us, Israel must, starting now, within 30 days, act on the following concrete measures. It says act on the following concrete measures. So should we assume that's all of the following concrete measures?
I'm just not going to speak to it beyond what's laid out in the letter. So, Said, go ahead.
Thank you, Matt. Just a clarification, so I can understand. Why the letter? Just to make it more formal? I mean, as opposed to a phone call showing that this is a very urgent situation?
I think I just answered that in response to Kai's question. We have not seen sufficient results over the past few weeks. Continue to have concerns, which is why they laid out the changes that we want to see happen in this letter.
So, and why the 30 days? I mean, so must the 400,000 Palestinians wait 30 days? I mean, some of them may starve by then.
The letter
incinerated, as we have seen.
The letter is quite clear that we want to see changes immediately. And in fact, the secretary sent that letter on Sunday. We did see humanitarian assistance go in through Erez yesterday. Mm-hmm. And we very much want to see changes, not wait for 30 days, but happen immediately. Now, we recognize that some things, like, for example, the letter calls for agreements on what actually would be dual use items. That's not something that can happen overnight. That requires a negotiation. So some things take a little bit longer, but there are changes that we want to see implemented immediately.
Mm-hmm. Let me just have a couple more on Gaza, then a couple on the West Bank. But, the Washington Post reported, I think yesterday, about the strike against Al-Aqsa Hospital in the middle of Gaza, striking the tents, burning people alive and so on. Now, Israel always says that there are militants, that we never know whether there were or not, but that seems to be a story that is repeated every day. The Gaza people wake up every day to another 100 people dead or something like this. Now, I asked you about this last week, and you said, no, we would never accept this being normalized, but in fact, it is being normalized.
It's not. What happened in that strike was horrifying. We understand the very difficult environment in which Israel operates. But the results of that strike were deeply disturbing. Mm-hmm. We all saw that video and all know that it's horrifying to see people burned to death. We have made clear our serious concerns about the matter directly to the government of Israel.
Mm-hmm. Is it horrifying enough to be considered a war crime?
So I cannot make that kind of assessment from here. As you know, Said, there's a process that we have to go through to assess the facts of the law when it comes to any individual determination.
Yeah, but this seems to be going on every day in and day out. And, on the ceasefire talks, Haaretz is reporting that Israel is saying no more talks, no more negotiations. Can you comment on that?
So I cannot confirm what's reported, I assume based on anonymous sources. We have continued to engage with the government of Israel to try and get a ceasefire over the line. As you have heard us say, that requires not just Israel, but Hamas making difficult decisions. And it continues to be the case that Hamas is not at the bargaining table in any kind of a serious way to talk about how we get an agreement.
So you are still saying that if Hamas comes back to the table and they come up with, reasonable, whatever, stance and so on,